Pier Delta at Naval Base Kitsap-Bremerton has been empty for 400 days. Not decommissioned, not converted, not leased. Empty, maintained, dredged, powered, and waiting. The last hull that occupied it was USS Kitty Hawk, CV-63, a conventionally powered carrier that left Bremerton under tow in May 2022 on her final transit to the breakers in Brownsville, Texas. What replaced her at Pier Delta was nothing, and that nothing has cost the United States Navy real money every single month to preserve. That is not an accident. The Port Scheduling Office at Naval Base Kitsap manages pier assignments across more than a dozen active berthing positions. Pier Delta's sustained vacancy is a deliberate hold, renewed through multiple planning cycles, against a queue of auxiliary and support vessels that could have absorbed the space. When a pier of that class sits empty, it sits empty because someone made a decision, and then remade that decision repeatedly at cost. That is the move, an empty pier, maintained at cost, on the most carrier-dense naval base on the American West Coast. While the PLAN's newest supercarrier, Fujian, CV-18, completed her final sea trials in the East China Sea and was formally declared operationally ready in the spring of 2026. The question is not why a pier is empty, the question is why the Navy is paying to keep it empty in exactly that configuration, at exactly that depth, with exactly those power feeds intact, at exactly this moment in the Pacific. The answer is not about a pier. It is about a math problem that only becomes visible when you lay the West Coast carrier maintenance schedule over a Taiwan contingency timeline, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Pull back to the map first. The United States operates 11 nuclear-powered aircraft carriers. Of those 11 hulls, the Navy's planning assumption is that roughly one-third are in some phase of maintenance at any given moment. Refueling and complex overhaul, incremental availabilities, or post-deployment repair periods. The available pool at any moment is closer to 7 or 8 hulls, and of those, some portion is always in transit, cycling through training, unavailable for immediate tasking. The working number for a surge scenario, for a genuine crisis that demands every operational carrier in the same theater, is somewhere between 5 and 6 hulls on short notice. 5 or 6 hulls. Against a planned surface force that now includes 3 carrier strike groups of its own, a land-based missile inventory that can threaten carrier operations inside the first island chain, and a submarine force that has roughly doubled its attack boat count in the last decade. The geometry of carrier power projection in the Western Pacific has changed. The question is not whether America can project power toward Taiwan. The question is whether it can do so fast enough, and with enough hulls concentrated in the right window, to make a Chinese military calculation come out the wrong way. That calculation depends on one thing above all others: carrier availability. And carrier availability in a surge scenario depends on one thing above all others: dry dock and wet berth capacity on the Pacific coast. A radar scope sweeps its slow circle in a darkened operations room. The blip is not a ship. It is a held berth at a pier in Puget Sound, and it has just moved from a real estate story to a strategy story. Puget Sound Naval Shipyard, PSNS, is the primary maintenance facility for West Coast carriers. It operates 2 dry docks capable of accepting a nuclear supercarrier, Dry Dock 6, which can handle a Nimitz-class CVN with minimal reconfiguration, and the newer extended capacity of Dry Dock 4, modified specifically to accommodate the Ford class. Those 2 docks are the entire West Coast nuclear carrier dry dock capacity. There are no other facilities between San Diego and Bremerton that can pull a CVN out of the water for scheduled maintenance. The 3rd and 4th West Coast supercarrier-capable dry docks are at Puget Sound Naval Shipyard as well, but they are optimized for auxiliary and submarine work, and are not configured for RCOH cycling without significant lead time reconfiguration. Now run the maintenance math. A Nimitz-class RCOH takes approximately 4 years from induction to completion, 4 years where a hull is completely unavailable. Shorter incremental availabilities run 6 to 18 months. The Ford class has had its own maintenance timeline complications, with USS Gerald R. Ford spending more time in availability than originally projected during her early operational years, compressing the maintenance window geometry for the class as more Fords enter the rotation. In 2025 and into 2026, the West Coast carrier maintenance queue included USS Abraham Lincoln completing her availability at PSNS, and USS Carl Vinson cycling through an extended planned incremental availability, 2 hulls simultaneously in or near Puget Sound maintenance status. Both of PSNS's primary supercarrier dry docks were committed or scheduled. The throughput limit of the West Coast maintenance infrastructure was, in practical terms, being tested. What this means in surge terms, if you need to accelerate the completion of a maintenance availability to return a hull to operational status sooner than scheduled, you need somewhere to do the final wet berth work after dry dock. You need a pier that is deep enough, powered enough, and pier-side equipped enough to handle a nuclear carrier during the transition from dry dock back to operational status. That pier needs to be at or adjacent to the maintenance facility, and it needs to be available on short notice. Pier Delta holds a carrier-length berth, fenders rigged, utility hookups live, the island superstructure of an absent ship reflected in the water beneath the crane rails. That configuration has been maintained since Kitty Hawk was homeported there. It was maintained after Kitty Hawk left. Naval Base Kitsap and PSNS have held it in that ready state through 3 separate maintenance planning cycles, each one an opportunity to absorb the berth for lay-aside storage or auxiliary berthing, each one a choice to leave it exactly as it is. Going through the public contract records for PSNS maintenance work and NAVFAC Pacific Pier infrastructure spending, one thing keeps coming back. Pier Delta's preservation budget is classified as operational readiness infrastructure, not historical preservation, not deferred conversion. It is being funded as an active strategic asset. The contract language matters here. When NAVFAC Pacific awards a maintenance and sustainment task order for a pier facility, the funding category determines the planning horizon and the operational authority required to convert or decommission the asset. Historical preservation funding can be redirected with a regional commander's approval on a quarterly basis. Operational readiness infrastructure funding requires a formal decommissioning assessment, a joint staff review, and in some cases congressional notification. Pier Delta is in the second category. No one below the level of Chief of Naval Operations can quietly redirect its purpose without generating a paper trail that would surface in the budget process. Someone put it there deliberately, and keeping it there has required active decisions not to move it. The common assumption is that an empty pier represents a gap in force structure, a relic of a retired hull that has not yet been assigned a replacement. That assumption is wrong in one key detail. An empty pier maintained at operational readiness does not represent a gap, it is a reserved option. And reserved options are only worth their cost if the scenario that requires them has a non-trivial probability. So what is the scenario? The scenario is this. PLAN Fujian becomes operational, China makes a move against Taiwan, the United States needs to surge carrier presence in the Western Pacific inside a 90-day window, and at least one West Coast CVN is in a maintenance status that can be accelerated. In that scenario, the ability to pull a hull out of dry dock early, complete her systems testing at a wet berth adjacent to PSNS, and transit her toward the Western Pacific ahead of schedule, is the difference between 5 hulls in the theater and 4. That one hull, at the moment of crisis, changes the Chinese calculus, not because one carrier decides a conflict, because a 5th carrier in the theater changes the probability math for every operation in the theater simultaneously. Think about what that systems testing phase actually looks like at a wet berth. It is not ceremonial. Propulsion plant restart after a dry dock availability requires controlled power escalation over days, not hours. Combat systems integration testing requires pier-side connectivity to shore-based test equipment that is wired into Pier Delta's existing infrastructure. Electromagnetic compatibility checks, sonar dome flooding and calibration, catapult and arresting gear hydraulic pressure cycling on a Ford-class hull. All of that has to happen at a wet berth before the hull can move under her own power toward open water. Compressing that process by even 2 weeks, in a crisis timeline, requires the pier to already be configured for it. You cannot rig a cold pier to handle that load on short notice. You need the power feeds run, the shore connections terminated, the fender systems maintained to the right load ratings. Pier Delta has all of that. A converted pier does not. This is the part of the strategic argument that does not appear in public statements and does not get mapped in most analyses of Pacific carrier power. The dry dock schedule is classified as a logistics detail. The pier maintenance budget is buried in NAVFAC appropriations. But what it represents, when you lay it over the Taiwan contingency timeline, is something quite specific. The United States is maintaining the physical infrastructure to surge its West Coast carrier capacity by roughly 25% in a single 90-day window. That is the reframe. Pier Delta is not an empty pier, it is a surge option stored in concrete. Now set Fujian against that picture. CV-18 Fujian, named for the mainland Chinese province directly across the strait from Taiwan, is the PLAN's first catapult-equipped carrier. She completed sea trials between late 2023 and early 2026, validating her electromagnetic catapult system, her arrested recovery systems, her air-wing integration, and her carrier strike group coordination capability. She is assessed to be capable of operating fixed-wing aircraft at higher sortie rates than her predecessors, Liaoning and Shandong, which operate ski jump launches and therefore carry lighter, lower fuel load aircraft packages. Fujian changes the plane carrier calculus in one specific way. She can operate heavier, longer-range aircraft, including what Western analysts assess as a carrier-adapted variant of the J-15, from a catapult launch that gives those aircraft their full fuel and weapons load from the start of every mission. What those improved sortie rates mean in a Taiwan scenario is not abstract. A carrier that can generate 60 combat sorties per day instead of 40 is not 50% more capable in a simple linear sense. It is exponentially more dangerous in time-compressed operations, because the additional sorties arrive before the adversary has cycled his defensive response. Fujian's catapult advantage collapses the decision timeline for anyone operating within her air wing's reach. What she does not change, and this is the asymmetry the U.S. strategic community has been pricing since her keel was laid, is the basing geometry of the first island chain. Fujian, operating in the East China Sea or the Philippine Sea, is inside the range envelope of U.S. land-based air power from Guam, from Isika sites in the Philippines, and from Yokosuka. She is not operating in open ocean where carrier versus carrier math is the only math. She is operating in a layered environment where U.S. Aegis destroyers, Ohio-class guided missile submarines, and B-21 raiders flying from Guam or Andersen Air Force Base can all reach her. The plan has invested heavily in anti-access and area denial systems to complicate that picture. The U.S. has invested in maintaining the infrastructure to sustain more hulls in that environment simultaneously. Here is the take that will probably draw some pushback from the defense community. Fujian's real strategic value is not what she can do in a conflict. It is what her existence forces the U.S. to do before one. Every dollar spent maintaining Pier Delta every month Dry Dock 6 is scheduled rather than deprioritized. Every accelerated carrier maintenance availability funded slightly above projection is driven by Fujian as a political and strategic fact. The plan did not build Fujian to fight carriers. They built her to force America to spend money maintaining infrastructure it would otherwise let atrophy. And America is spending that money. The pier is the evidence. One detail that stuck in working through the PSNS infrastructure records, the depth maintenance at Pier Delta was last certified in December 2024, not in 2022 when Kitty Hawk left, not in 2023 when a conversion study was apparently completed and then shelved. In December 2024, 4 months after Fujian completed her first full carrier air wing integration exercise in the East China Sea. The timing is not proof of a direct causal link, but it is not nothing either. Depth certification for a carrier-class pier is not a bureaucratic formality. The survey requires a contracted hydrographic team, multi-beam sonar mapping of the entire berth footprint, physical inspection of the mooring hardware and cathodic protection systems, and submission to NAVFAC Pacific for engineering review. That process runs roughly 4 months, from contract award to certification issuance, which means the decision to initiate the December 2024 certification was made in roughly August 2024, within weeks of Fujian's air wing integration exercise. Someone in the Navy's infrastructure planning chain was watching Fujian's operational milestones and responding to them in concrete, measurable ways. That chain of decisions is what Pier Delta represents. Now run the second-order consequences. What does China see when it looks at Pier Delta? China's naval intelligence has access to commercial satellite imagery, to OSINT tracking of NAVFAC contract awards, to shipping lane monitoring that would detect any change in the deep draft vessel traffic pattern at Bremerton. They know the pier is empty. They know it is maintained. They can calculate the same dry dock math that any competent naval analyst can run from public sources. What they see is an American decision to sustain surge capacity at cost, sustained over multiple planning cycles, without any announced program to fill the berth with a specific hull. That is the message. Not the carrier at Yokosuka, not the destroyer patrol in the South China Sea. The empty pier at Bremerton, maintained and ready, is the signal to Beijing that American carrier capacity planning is not built around current force structure. It is built around contingency surge requirements that assume a compressed crisis timeline. Beijing's response to that signal is itself legible in the infrastructure record, if you know where to look. The PLAN has accelerated construction of its own dry dock and maintenance facilities at Yulin Naval Base on Hainan Island. The Yulin expansion, visible in commercial satellite imagery from 2023 onward, includes a new deep draft berthing pier capable of handling CV-18 class hulls, and what appears to be covered dry dock infrastructure that would reduce the vulnerability of carrier maintenance operations to overhead observation. China is reading the American infrastructure signal and responding with infrastructure of its own. The pier in Bremerton is generating pier construction in Hainan. That is how deterrence calculus actually works at the level of physical plant. Will the surge infrastructure actually be used? The honest answer is that its value lies precisely in never being used, in being credible enough as an option that no adversary wants to test it. That is the logic of deterrence infrastructure everywhere. Andersen Air Force Base in Guam is the most expensive piece of runway in the Western Pacific, precisely because the bombers that use it should, in theory, never need to fly their combat loadouts. The missiles and THAAD batteries in South Korea are valuable because they should never have to intercept anything. Pier Delta, maintained at cost and kept empty, is valuable because the scenario that requires it should, in theory, never materialize. But the theory is doing more work than it used to. Fujian's operational certification, the acceleration of PLAN amphibious exercise activity in 2025 and into 2026, the ongoing pressure campaign against Philippine EDICA facilities, the continued testing of anti-satellite and long-range precision strike systems, all of these data points are moving in a direction that compresses the timeline on which the theoretical becomes operational. The amphibious exercise data point deserves specific attention. In the 12 months between April 2025 and April 2026, the PLAN conducted 3 large-scale amphibious landing exercises in the East China Sea and the Bohai Gulf. Each exercise involved a larger complement of Type 075 landing helicopter docks than the previous one. The Type 075 is China's equivalent of a U.S. Navy amphibious assault ship capable of landing a full Marine battalion with aviation support. 3 exercises in 12 months, each larger than the last, is not a training cycle. It is a capability demonstration with an intended audience. The U.S. Indo-Pacific Command has been explicit in its public posture assessments that the 2027 window, the centenary of the People's Liberation Army, is an elevated risk period for Taiwan contingency planning. The 2027 window is inside the planning horizon for every infrastructure decision currently being made at Puget Sound Naval Shipyard. Pier Delta's most recent depth certification runs to 2027. That is not a coincidence. Looking back at this from the outside, the real question about the Bremerton Pier is not whether it was preserved deliberately. It clearly was. The real question is whether the signal it sends is the intended one, or whether the intended audience reads it differently. Beijing's strategic planners are not naive about surge capacity math. They can run the same numbers. A U.S. decision to maintain surge infrastructure does not necessarily deter. It can also communicate urgency. It can communicate that the United States believes the contingency is close enough to warrant active preservation of options, and that assessment can itself feed into Chinese strategic calculations about timing. There is a version of this analysis where Pier Delta makes the crisis more likely, not less, by convincing Beijing that Washington believes a crisis is imminent and is therefore positioning to respond rapidly. Deterrence and provocation are not always distinguishable from the other side of the strait. The infrastructure that signals American resolve also signals American anxiety. Both signals arrive simultaneously. Which one Beijing acts on is not something you can control from a pier in Bremerton. The one variable that remains genuinely unresolved is Yokosuka. USS George Washington has been homeported at Yokosuka since 2015, maintaining the U.S. forward carrier presence in Japan that has been continuous since the Cold War. If Japan's domestic political situation or a Chinese escalation package targeted specifically at U.S. basing in Japan forces a renegotiation of that homeport arrangement, the Yokosuka carrier slot goes away. The West Coast then becomes not a surge pathway but the primary maintenance and readiness hub for the entire Pacific carrier force. In that scenario, Pier Delta goes from a reserved option to an operational necessity. The geometry of the problem does not change, the urgency of the answer does. The Yokosuka dependency is the variable that keeps Pacific Fleet planners awake in ways that public statements do not capture. Japan's host nation support agreement, renewed in 2021, runs through 2026. Renegotiation is already in process. The terms of that renewal, specifically the question of whether Japan will accept continued U.S. nuclear carrier homeporting given the domestic political pressures following several high-profile incidents near U.S. base perimeters, are genuinely uncertain. A U.S. carrier homeported at Yokosuka is a forward deterrent. It is also a target. Japan's calculus on that trade-off has been shifting, and not toward greater tolerance for strategic risk absorption. There is one more open question the map cannot yet answer. USS Enterprise, CVN-80, is under construction at Newport News. She is the third Ford-class carrier and is projected to join the fleet in the late 2020s. Her homeport assignment has not been announced. A Pacific homeport, potentially Bremerton, would change the Pier Delta calculation entirely. The berth would no longer be a surge reserve. It would be an occupied facility and a different pier would need to be preserved or a different dry dock slot would need to be extended to maintain the same surge margin. The infrastructure problem does not get solved by filling the pier, it gets moved. CVN-80's assignment decision will be driven by factors that are only partially strategic. Congressional equities in Virginia, the homeport preferences expressed by prospective commanding officers rotating through the Ford-class pipeline, The diplomatic signaling value of a Pacific versus Atlantic homeport for the third hull of America's most advanced carrier class, the industrial base argument for keeping more carriers accessible to East Coast shipyard capacity, all of those considerations are in play simultaneously. The answer, when it comes, will look like a decision. It will actually be a negotiated outcome across at least 5 competing institutional interests, and whatever it is, the infrastructure implication will generate its own follow-on set of decisions about which pier preserves the surge option that Pier Delta currently holds. That is where the board stands in August 2026. Fujian is operational. The PSNS dry dock schedule is committed through at least 2027. Pier Delta is maintained, empty, and certified to accept a nuclear supercarrier on short notice. The U.S. Navy does not build carrier infrastructure for wars it expects to fight. It preserves carrier infrastructure for wars it refuses to be caught unprepared for. Bremerton is where that refusal is stored. Pier crews walk the deck in rain gear, checking fender lines. A maintenance log shows another day marked off. The berth is ready. The carrier is not there yet. The Navy has not said which hull fills that berth next, and the strategic value of the berth depends entirely on the answer remaining open. An undeclared option is a credible deterrent. A declared plan is a schedule. The difference between those two things is the difference between deterrence and vulnerability. Pier Delta is deterrence in its most literal form, a commitment of resources to a contingency that should never arrive, paid for month after month precisely because the cost of being wrong is incalculable. The monthly cost of maintaining Pier Delta at operational readiness status runs, based on comparable NAVFAC task order structures for carrier-capable pier facilities, somewhere in the range of several $100,000 per month when you include dredging certification cycles, power infrastructure maintenance, mooring system inspection, and the pier-side connectivity upkeep for combat systems testing feeds. Over 400 days, that is a real number. Not a catastrophic number by Navy budget standards, but real enough that it requires active justification in every planning cycle. Someone keeps making that justification, and the justification keeps getting accepted. That is the decision chain that matters, not the pier itself. The USS Gerald R. Ford sits at pier, deck crews moving equipment across the angled flight deck, the carrier island rising above the waterline in the gray Pacific light. The infrastructure visible in that shot is the next move. We are going to map it. The carrier berth does not move, the geometry it argues for does not change, and the bill for keeping it ready arrives every month, whether the hull that fills it ever needs to sail or not. That is the logic of Pacific deterrence in 2026. Not the steel that is moving. The infrastructure maintained for the steel that might need to move. A carrier strike group holds position beyond the horizon, flight deck clear, aircraft spotted but engines cold. The decision to launch has not been made. The decision to be ready to launch has been made every day for 400 days.